Red Bull has been absolutely dominant in the 2022 season, leaving nothing to the case or to their competitors. However, it is very unlikely to be the case in 2023, and the team will see a massive decrease in performance. On top of that, they have issues when it comes to the chemistry of their drivers, which is something that could be addressed as soon as 2023. Perez's seat is far from stable, and with what is expected of Red Bull in 2023 regarding the budget cap breach penalty, the team will lose a massive amount of pace and performance and will likely lose the title of the best constructor on the grid. There's hundreds of things to unpack, but we promise not to waste your time and get the whole thing across in less than 8 minutes. Ready? Let's go. Although the team dominated the 2022 season, with Verstappen winning 15 out of 22 races, it was far from an all-perfect season for the Austrian team. For example, they struggled a lot with Perez, a driver who is also a fan favorite and will likely lose his seat in 2023 if the situation between him and Verstappen doesn't change. On top of that, the team has been penalized harshly for the 2023 season, with the team having 10% less wind tunnel and CFD time. An additional 5% will be added to these figures due to Red Bull winning the Constructors' Championship after finishing second last season, which will severely hurt them in the 2023 season. Verstappen is a driver who cemented himself as the #1 driver in Red Bull, and up until Brazil, everyone thought that Perez was the perfect wingman for the Dutchman. However, the Mexican showed teeth when Verstappen didn't give back his position in Brazil, and although Perez had all the right to react the way he did, the team reminded him what his position was and how easily he could lose it. And by this, we mean literally remind him. The team signed Ricciardo as its third driver. While many thought this was a friendly act of Red Bull reuniting the guy who won 7 races for them from 2014 to 2018, it's far from that. Ricciardo knows how to drive the car, and quite honestly, he's been a very decent driver in his years with Red Bull. As of now, the Aussie wouldn't mind being a wingman to Verstappen, with his situation being what it is. And if Perez thinks he can talk and challenge Verstappen, then his position in the team is likely to be deleted. What was a huge problem for Red Bull is the fact that Perez has turned from a championship contender early in the season, with him having only a 15-point deficit to Verstappen after Monaco, to a guy who was probably the slowest of the top 6 drivers on the grid. True, the RB18 received numerous upgrades and improvements, but unlike Perez, Verstappen was able to fully grasp them and drive the RB18 to its limits. But here comes the most interesting part. While many think that Verstappen is just a generational talent that can drive everything that's thrown at him, which is partially true, one couldn't help but wonder, did Red Bull build the car purposely to drive Perez away? The Mexican said that he doesn't feel comfortable in the car after the upgrades started coming, and after what happened in Brazil, the narrative of Red Bull deliberately sabotaging their #2 driver in order to keep their #1 driver happy is becoming more and more realistic. Even if it is true, Red Bull is going to face a massive problem. With their car being in optimum performance range to please Verstappen, Perez turned into one of the slowest drivers on the grid from the top 6, as we mentioned earlier in this video. If you compare the qualifying gaps between Perez and Verstappen, the Dutchman is by far dominating the Mexican, with an awkwardly large 5/10 advantage over the season. To compare this with Ferrari and Red Bull, the Maranello team drives a very thin gap, around 0.0006 seconds favoring Leclerc, while Mercedes' qualifying pace is just 1/10 of a second in favor of Russell. Imagine what will happen in 2023 when the sporting penalty is applied to Red Bull regarding their reduced wind tunnel time and CFD time. Although there is an engine freeze in place until 2026, the performance of new generation cars is also dependent on other factors, particularly aerodynamics. And the wind tunnels are the #1 utility that the teams are using in order to understand these aspects, which is why Red Bull is going to be severely hurt for the 2023 season. There is an array of new rules that are going to be implemented in 2023, such as increased ride height, increased diffuser throat, and increased diffuser edge stiffness. On top of that, another additional sensor will be introduced to monitor porpoising more effectively, meaning that the FIA decided to pay a lot of attention to the safety of the drivers, which is ultimately the right thing to do. So, why is Red Bull in trouble when they managed to absolutely destroy the competition with regulations that nobody else understood but them? Well, that is the exact nature of the problem. Red Bull built a car that can perform wonders when it's so low to the ground, something that Ferrari and Mercedes weren't able to do. Apart from straight line speed, which is heavily dependent on the RB18 stability, Red Bull was dominating in every other aspect of the track simply because they were able to construct an aerodynamic masterpiece in 2022. Now that the rules have been tweaked and all cars are going to be raised by 15 millimeters, the porpoising will be basically gone. Therefore, the field will be leveled and the advantage that Red Bull had in the 2022 regulations is practically gone. This is something that Christian Horner said when talking about the penalty that was given to his team, adding, The more draconian part is the sporting penalty, which is a 10% reduction in our ability to utilize our wind tunnel and aerodynamic tools. I've heard people reporting today that it's an insignificant amount. Let me tell you now, that is an enormous amount. That represents anywhere between a quarter and half a second of lap. That 10% will have an impact on our ability to perform on track. So it's very evident and obvious that Red Bull will have a lot of issues for the 2023 season, but if anyone can overcome this challenge, that has to be Max Verstappen. This is both a blessing and a curse for the team because it's very evident that Perez will struggle with the new regulations, and therefore, the team could be forced to implement Ricciardo in his seat. After all, Ricciardo has won 7 races with the team and understands the car's philosophy better than anyone else. In the last couple of races in 2022, we've seen that Mercedes and Ferrari have closed up the gap to Red Bull, which could be an alarming thing for the Austrian team when it comes to the second driver. If you think about it, Hamilton was able to win 5 championships thanks to Bottas and his sacrifices throughout the 5 years that he was Hamilton's teammate. Perez did his thing in 2021, but in 2022, we've seen that although Perez helped Verstappen a lot, he showed potential to dethrone him. Obviously, Verstappen is going to be asked about his preferences. Truth be said, you have some luxurious traits when you win 2 championships in a row after a long pause, one that lasted 8 years. And after 9 years, Red Bull are finally the Constructors' champions, but a huge portion of that goes to the dominance of Verstappen. True, Perez was almost P2 in the Drivers' Championship, something that Red Bull hasn't achieved in its existence, not even with Webber and Vettel in their golden days. However, the majority of his high point finishes were due to reliability issues with Ferrari and at a time when Mercedes had no idea what to do with its car. When all 6 drivers finished the race, Perez was usually slower than all of them, with the exception of Silverstone. There have been reports about Verstappen already asking the team to replace Perez after the outcome of the final 2 races in 2022. When everybody thought that Verstappen and Perez had a perfect relationship, these two were able to prove the world wrong. And it couldn't be a coincidence that the team signed Ricciardo as a reserve driver right when the situation between Perez and Verstappen was stirred up. That is why experts like Damon Hill and Ralf Schumacher believe that Sergio Perez's seat in Red Bull is everything but safe. And although Daniel Ricciardo could be a great replacement for the Mexican, it goes without saying that this is a risky move by the Austrian team. Ricciardo is in declining form, and his latest 2 years at McLaren have taken their toll on the Aussie. Obviously, he has a lot of confidence issues, and by the time he feels comfortable driving for Red Bull, it could be very late. Still, Ricciardo's attitude is what could land him a starting spot in Red Bull sooner rather than later, and Hill believes this is a foregone conclusion. It could be quite an interesting one if you think about the problems they have apparently had between Max and Sergio. Let's say the toys go out of the pram and there is some sort of fallout there. Daniel Ricciardo could be in prime position. It is his home, and he does owe a lot to Red Bull, so he will be very keen to be back in that fold. What is it about the prodigal son who returns? He could be in a good position coming back and having learned a lot in other places. It can be that you can improve having been somewhere else than returning to the place you started. What do you think will happen next with Red Bull? Do you think that the Austrian team will get on top of their problems? And what's your early pick for the Drivers and Constructors Championships in 2023? Let us know in the comments below.